Let's dive into DHEA and fasting into a little bit more detail because it's such a common practice now. I'll just give you a little story. When I first started talking about fasting in my practice, it actually first started happening after me experiencing fasting or fasting lifestyle for about 4 or 5 years. And I really didn't tell any patients about it. This was probably about 12 years ago. And I was worried that patients were going to think that I was crazy. Just the daily practice of intermittent fasting and seasonal extended fasts, and so I was a little nervous about recommending that for people or advising people on it. But eventually, I dove deeper into the science and application, and I found some amazing mentors to help me put this into practice in a practical doctor-patient practice setting, as opposed to just, hey, I'm going to try this out for a bit, and I think you should do it too. So I wanted to come from a science background. And so once I got the training and applied some of the theory and protocols, I was able to develop my own practice more deeply. So that's a little bit of my journey. So I've been doing fasting for a very long time now, and we take groups through these extended fasts, and we call it the metabolic upgrade. And we've got a program actually online that people can do it, a DIY version. And then we also meet virtually a few times a year to walk people through in a group setting. So if you do want to know more information about how to do this more practically, safely with the science, check out our webpage, drsjensen.com. You can find the program called the Metabolic Upgrade there for the DIY version. Because I think it's an important tool that we all could implement into our daily life to the degree that will benefit us. And that's one of the really one of the pieces I want to talk to you guys about today, because I think it's easy to just say everybody should fast. And at some point in my journey, I definitely thought that. But now that I've had more time, helping patients through this journey, my own practice, I can recognize where we can become almost too attached to it and almost too obsessed about it. So I want to talk about that in relation to DHEA. So let's just talk about it as a stress first. Fasting is a stress on the body. You're going for a period of time without food, and that's going to have, to you individually, we don't know all the consequences of that. But there's something called too much stress, and then there's eustress, which is normal stress. And then I would say there's in cases when there's not enough stress, or more appropriately said, maybe not the right type of stress, right? So too much stress is pretty obvious. That's someone who's on the go constantly. There's no downtime. They're constantly in their head. They haven't maybe developed a practice that allows you to get in touch with your consciousness, or that subconscious aspect of yourself, the hidden programs. So there's that person who's just so on the go, feeling overwhelmed, not getting stuff done, probably not sleeping well at night, going to bed too late, waking up late, using stimulants to get going in the morning, wine to wind down, or whatever that alcohol of choice might be to just turn off, the system upstairs. And many of us have maybe found ourselves there. Maybe many of us can relate to that version. And maybe they're pushing it hard in the gym constantly, doing the one type of exercise over and over and over again, maybe getting stuck with the physical results or the health results, and then have a huge plate, right? Maybe you got kids, and maybe you got a very expensive job, and and maybe your weekends are taken up with extra activities as a parent, or for work, or you're a weekend warrior, and just constantly the gas pedal is constantly down. Some version of that would definitely be too much stress. And then there's eustress. This is like conscious applied stress on the body that can elicit a proper hormonal response instead of an extended or chronic cortisol or high cortisol response, which we know that version of you, if you've got the gas pedal down all the time, you're pushing too heavy with a heavy foot on that cortisol, which is also going to deplete your DHEA. So let's talk about that eustress. This is a consciously applied intermittent fasting schedule where you're, listening to your body, you're putting the right food in when it's time to eat, you're closing the kitchen at the appropriate time. In our practice, when we see that people are doing this consciously with a good type of stress, they typically respond well, and their adrenal system can handle that load. But I think for a lot of people, when they just throw fasting into a really crazy lifestyle reality without any sort of downtime or internal, introspection, where they're working on their breath work or meditation practice or something to actually, hit the off switch or the turn down switch without the use of alcohol. these type of people can get quite stuck, right? And I think fasting in these types of individuals can actually lead to more problems than a good form of stress. And then the not enough stress, maybe that's the sedentary individual, the person who's just sitting on the couch. Just there's really not a lot of physical activity maybe in the work. There's not a lot of physical activity outside of work. There's just very sedentary. And this is also typically the type of behavior that's conducive to insulin resistance. So there might be higher food intake or the overfed state situation where there's not enough applied stress. And it turns out that those people could do really well with some conscious stress added to them in the form of fasting. So I just wanted to sort of lay that out there as sort of initial framework that there can be too much stress on the body, there can be not enough stress, and then there can be sort of the Goldilocks effect, which is just the right amount at the right time applied with the right force, right? We have to know ourselves individually. So different types of fasts mean different things. So I don't really think of intermittent fasting necessarily, or that daily compressed meal window, as true fasting. Listening to Dr. Jason Fung or some of the different experts, Walter Longo, or some of these different, fasting experts that have shared some of the research on fasting. Fasting is an engaging hormonal process that takes a few days to unfold, which can be done with, like the partial fast, like Dr. Walter Longo speaks to, or the water fast that Dr. Jason Fung might speak to. And this is where you're putting a more tenuous or longer stretch of time applied to the body for a more relevant specific outcome to initiate a true fasted state, which would be a huge fluctuation in our hormones. And initially, this fasting in the first 24 to 48 hours, you might get increased glucose spikes, increased cortisol. You're going to mobilize more glucose into the body to help you just sort of overcome this lack of food, which all these hormones are playing a role in. And then eventually, as you extend that, you start getting rises in epinephrine and adrenaline and things like that. And then growth hormone eventually kicks in. And so this podcast isn't necessarily going to dive into all the different stages of fasting, but it's important to lay out that what happens in a day is very different than what happens in 5 days. Just like if you're to just do intermittent fasting and never do an extended fast, that's going to be a different stress load on the body. And so that's going to show up differently as a different type of stress for your adrenal system. So, and for most people, as long as the gas pedal is not constantly down, doing a form of intermittent fasting on a very regular basis seems to work just fine. And I'm speaking more from our clinical expertise as opposed to all the different studies on it. But here's the interesting thing on DHEA and fasting is that it's just not clear. I mean, there's a lot of variables. People all operate a little bit differently. We have different BMIs, different life circumstances, different levels of activity, different levels of toxicity, different levels of emotional toxicity. There's a lot of different things going on for different people. But there was one study on the zebra finches, which don't necessarily correlate to the human physiology, but they were looking at aggression levels in these zebra finches when they were going for a relatively short period of time, but to them fasting. And what actually happened in that period of time without food is their aggression levels came up. And so they correlated that back to DHEA, which may translate to humans. But again, looking at zebra finches to address our physiology obviously isn't the best of sources. So, but there's not a lot of conclusive data to what happens to DHEA, whether it goes up or down in human populations. In PCOS cases, so women with polycystic ovarian syndrome, it turns out that doing some version of intermittent fasting can have a decreasing effect on DHEA. And I would say the most likely scenario for impact on PCOS is probably more to do with insulin regulation, because as you take time away from food, you will eventually improve insulin sensitivity, but you also bring insulin levels down. And so in these people with PCOS, they tend to be more prone to weight gain. And so they're more potentially insulin resistant. And so I think that there's these indirect effects of these excess androgens starting to decline because you're improving the sensitivity of insulin. And I think that's like one of the most important things I think that we can learn about DHEA in regards to fasting is that depending on our stress load, we might have different responses. But more importantly, what are all the permutations of having a better of having better insulin sensitivity. And I think that's the most important way to look at this, is if we're having an impact on insulin or lowering insulin resistance, improving the sensitivity of our cells to the hormone insulin, then we're probably going to have a better adrenal reserve. Our adrenal system's not going to be getting its butt kicked every 10 minutes because the blood sugar's all over the place. We're going to have a more sustained, steady response for these levels. And so I think, really addressing adrenal health and addressing, the time that we're spending in a fasted state and addressing us as an individual will give us different data. But from what I've seen, is it's not super clear whether or not someone's going to increase their DHEA in response to fasting, whether short-term or long-term. And from every study I've looked at, they keep saying that not enough data is there to tell us definitively what actually happens to DHEA when fasting. But like I said, I think it just goes back to the individual. And if we're constantly that gas pedal down, too much stress individual, you may not have a beneficial effect of DHEA on fasting. And I say all this because at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see clinically, because often when people are doing the right things, plural, they tend to have a better response in how the DHEA is behaving. So you have to stay tuned for the rest of those details. And then I want to share a little bit about a population of people that maybe are afraid of fasting. And I'll talk specifically about a friend of mine, a trainer who I got to do an extended fast. I recommended a 5-day fast just to try it out. He was healthy, very lean, very, very bulked, but lean individual. Obviously took really good care of himself in the gym, physically very strong. And there was tremendous amount of fear there about considering doing an extended fast. And I said, listen, it's just, 5 days of your life, whatever you were doing before, you can get back into. And my challenge to you is that, because you've got such good muscle build and you're worried about losing muscle in this fast, why don't you just keep exercising every day? You might not be able to do the full intensity workout that you're used to, but I encourage you to stay active and keep lifting weights during your experience. You might just find that your endurance isn't quite as, strong. Your energy may be a little bit waning, especially in the first couple of days. But let's just make that one criteria that you keep active during your fast. And so we measured his body composition before entering the fast and literally every day of the fast. And what we saw, maybe to your surprise or maybe not, is that his fat mass went down, which makes sense. He got into ketosis. He started burning up some of that fat, but his muscle mass actually increased. He obviously looked more chiseled than he did when he started, but his muscle mass was increasing because the stimulus for muscle growth was still there, despite not having the protein, which is, very scary for people who are trying to maintain size and not lose weight and whatnot. And it was a tremendous insight for this individual who actually ended up pausing or stopping the fast of 4 days, not because he couldn't make it to the 5th day, but because he had a big dinner event coming the next night. And he wanted to try to break the fast according to how we typically recommend and not move into this big meal and, hurt his GI tract with an onslaught of food. So we did end the fast a little bit earlier, but it was very insightful for him to see that he actually maintained and actually built muscle mass, lost fat mass, and actually did a pretty good job of maintaining his energy and wasn't too struggled. Now, we have a specific way in which we support people during fasting with certain supplements and things like that to help to prevent catabolism or breakdown. And like I said, you can check out those details in more detail if you'd like on the DIY version of the metabolic upgrade, or join us on one of our upcoming group sessions. So because it's an important tool, right? It doesn't fix everything, but I tell you what, if it's not in the tool belt, it probably, you could definitely do some research to find out whether or not it's going to work for you. But I think, my hope here in this initial discussion around fasting and DHEA is really where I'm at on this whole adrenal health spectrum, and look back to maybe some of the previous podcasts to really help to outline the adrenal health component if you're not totally clear, because I think really understanding that can give you more insight in how maybe you did on a fast in the past and why that maybe hurt you or hindered you or troubled you, or maybe why you did really well because you had the right amount of stress with the right force at the right time. So those kind of things are really important, I think, when addressing DHEA levels in fasting. So basically, we don't know enough, right? When have you heard that before? But I think it's important, right? I think it's important to say that this definitively does this or not. I think we can't say that unless there's a tremendous amount of confidence. And like I said, I'm going to give you my clinical experience at the end, so you can make use of that information any way you see fit. But I think and some of this information we just don't yet know, right? Because here's just one last thing I guess I should say on this is that there's a ton of information or articles written on like testosterone is boosted when fasting, and one would think that if testosterone is getting boosted, DHEA probably is too, DHEA being the precursor to testosterone. And so, and that's not the scope of this discussion, like I said, but I tell this to patients too, and I would say that that very well could have been the case for this trainer who was still stimulating testosterone through exercise, was still stimulating muscle growth, yet not necessarily having access to the daily protein intake. But as we know from autophagy, breaking down cellular material, he's probably recycling a lot of the proteins that were getting broken down because they were in damaged tissue that was no longer serving him. And then he got to repackage those proteins and put them into areas that are needing that stimulus or needing that repair, right? So there is a ton of information out there, or we're being told that there's all sorts of reasons too fast to build testosterone. And again, even with that information, I'd say it's so individual. You can't say that everybody's going to get whatever it is, it says 180% to 1500% improvement in testosterone with fasting. Maybe you will, maybe you won't, right? Like we're all individuals.